Greetings
I
to
don't have a
episode.
I don't have a recording signal on my computer. Are we recording?
What? If we are recording, yeah.
All right. Interesting.
So says,
Oops. Okay.
can you hear that cat?
Yeah. Okay, now I've got it. All right, good. We're recording.
Okay. I'm fostering a cat,
Oh.
and it's chosen this moment to say, anyway. Okay. Greetings, everyone, to another episode of Geddry and Jurich. And today we're going to be talking about fascism and the importance of media in fascism. This is my co-host Israel Jurek, and I chose this topic this week because recently somebody locally accused me of being a commie Nazi, which is an interesting combination.
Yeah,
But
the diametrically opposed bitter enemies.
yeah, but whatever. So I thought that was interesting. But it occurred to me that a lot of people, myself included, because I was pretty reluctant to even using the term fascism for a long time, but I've warmed up to it. Particularly, I've warmed up to it since January 6th. But I've warmed up to it even locally as I see examples of it presenting itself all the time. So I thought it would be good to discuss just what fascism is or what it means.
Hmm?
And I wanted to go through a few little points. And I know
Yeah.
you're well
I,
versed.
I just wanted to say I think it's really important that we talk about what fascism is, because I think that's one of the areas where a lot of people are actually ignorant about what makes a system or a framework fascist. We have as part of our historical national mythos this great conflict that we engage in to defend the world against fascism, and that's created in our minds this idea that the United States is inherently anti-fascist, and that our opposition to the Nazis and to the Italian fascists and to the Japanese Empire creates this sense of our identity as automatically opposed to it. And that's been worked into our education in terms of US history and world history, so much so that we all are raised with this understanding that fascism is bad and America is a good champion of liberty and justice, and we defended the world from fascism, alongside our allies, the USSR, although that doesn't
Right.
get talked about as much. But they were our allies in the fight against the Nazis, and we
Sure.
wouldn't have been able to defeat the Nazis as soundly as we did without the USSR.
I think, didn't they pay the biggest price in blood?
Oh, yeah, I mean,
By
yeah,
far, like
absolutely. A significant
20,
portion of the European
20
theater was
million
fought.
Russians.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the main reason for that is because of how much of the war was fought in the Soviet Union. That was a major
Right.
battleground area, whereas the rest of Europe was occupied, but not an
Yes.
open battleground until D-Day and the invasion on D-Day, and then the rest of Europe really started becoming a battleground, but not nearly as long as the Soviet Union suffered under the war. And and so talking about what fascism is, that's not something we really learned. We learned about the Nazis, we learned a little bit about the Italians, but we didn't really learn about what they believed, what they opposed, and how they came to power, and the
Right.
techniques that they used. We know about the anti-Semitism in the concentration camps, and that becomes like this kind of way in which modern fascists try to avoid the label, because fascism doesn't mean Nazism, and
Mm-hmm.
Nazism is just one way. If you read one of the survivors of Italian fascism, a man named Umberto Eco, he describes that as that fascism, it ultimately takes on the contours of whatever national culture that produces it. So fascism in Germany looked different than it did in Italy, with very different cultures.
Sure.
In Japan looked very different, and in Spain looked very different. And in the United States, it's gonna take on the characteristics of American culture that foster it. So we need to know what those are. And I think one of the reasons why so many people who are conservative or who are on the far right, not conservative, extremist reactionaries, don't recognize how close to fascism they are or how fascist they actually are is because they don't know what fascism is. And so, of course, they're going to reject the label. They're going to deny the label. They're oftentimes unaware that the views and ideas and the tactics that they're utilizing are exactly what fascists use, and they are definitively fascist. So I think it's important to name that, and I think it's also important to identify how fascism fits into the broader political spectrum. So I'm excited about this episode, and like toss it
Well,
back to you so you can make those points that you were going to make.
I'm looking for feedback, trust me.
Oh yeah, okay.
So basically, it's considered by experts, fascism experts think of that as a mass political movement that emphasizes extreme nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of both the nation and the single powerful leader over the individual citizen. So for me, the turning point in being able to use that word label comfortably came on January 6th when all these individuals were willing to do what they did for the single powerful leader, in their opinion. Now, I don't, enough, down, no. I don't know what the appeal has been to Donald Trump. To me, he's coarse, crass, gauche, basically illiterate, and brag. He just has, but because I don't watch TV and I never watched any of his programs, he just came across as phony from the get-go to me. But people were willing to do all these things to keep him in power, which is one of the symptoms of fascism. That you have to do whatever you can to keep the supreme leader in power. And I also think that while a lot of these, like Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and more, they
Pinochet.
Pinochet, they appear to come into power quickly. I think the precursor that allowed them. Would you mind? My dog is okay off. Okay, down. I think the seeds that enabled them to grab onto power had been festering for a long period of time. And I think that when Trump came into power, there was a lot of discontent on the left and the right with the wealth gap and the the state of the environment and so forth. And everybody agreed that what we're doing isn't necessarily working. This two-party thing isn't necessarily working out to everybody's advantage. But we see a very different solution to fixing that. And I think that but the fascist thing pushes on this extreme nationalism coupled with this kind of cult of personality, and that it plays on people's discontent. And then they utilize this kind of nostalgic make America great again, but when was it great? And in fact, not a local, but I think it was the Daily Show, uh, some people out to say, when was America great? And asking all these MAGA types, and they really didn't have an answer for that.
I think recognizing we can. I'm just going to tangent a little bit on that slogan. We do know the dog whistle aspect of the slogan, obviously, and we know its parallel slogan alongside with it was America First, which had historically been used by the KKK. But I think this, and this is how I'm going to tie it into with the topic of fascism, the idea of Make America Great Again and the way it appealed to that voter base is this recognition, I think, across the board. I think a lot of us recognize across the board that the American empire is in decline.
Oh.
We're aware of that. And so that slogan is not necessarily about making America great again in the sense of finding a period in our history that we want to emulate, but rather restoring the power that America has been able to project worldwide, because that's in decline and we know it's in decline. And because we know that it's in decline, we have this anxiety about our own quality of life, our own capacity to maintain a kind of security and liberty that at least a significant portion of our population has enjoyed over the last few generations. And so that's the anxiety that appeals to. And I think as the empire declines, this appeal to fascism is really about trying to reclaim that power and to reclaim it by force and by projection of might. And we saw Trump as that kind of figure, at least in terms of how he wanted to project himself as this powerful person who the rest of the world feared and respected. Although they thought of him as a clown and laughed at him, that wasn't that wasn't the narrative, of course, that his party was projecting. And I think that's one of the things we have to recognize, why fascism is appealing right now and why it's going to continue to be a threat going forward for the next few decades, is that the decline of our American empire, that we have leaders who are going to want to try to solve that for our people, who are going to want to capitalize on that anxiety, so to speak, and create solutions or scapegoats. And in this case, what we're seeing from the fascists, first of all, is the creation of scapegoats. It's one of the easiest to identify tactics in the rise of fascism is, oh, is the economy suffering? Is society struggling? And it is. But let's not blame it on income inequality and this massive wealth gap where a small percentage of the population owns 90% of the property in the country and the rest of us have to pay to survive. Oh, let's not blame it on that. Let's find other scapegoats so that we don't make massive economic changes and create social equality. Let's justify the social inequalities, call them natural and good, and let's blame these threats to that. Let's blame transgender people. Let's blame people of color. But not explicitly. We're gonna talk about them in coded language and criminalize them, and then blame criminals. That kind of thing. And so we've seen scapegoating happening for a long time. We're used to it, but we're seeing it go in overdrive now with all the over 500 anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ bills passed in state legislators around the country, or at least not necessarily passed, but at least introduced around the country.
Yeah.
Many of them have passed, particularly in places like Florida and Tennessee and Montana. and and so we're looking at this rise of fascism and this tactic of scapegoating to try to leverage that anxiety about the decline of the American empire and push an agenda of make America great again through basically a fascist establishment of fascism. A distinctly American fascism, which I don't think will depend on a single great leader. I think every leader that gets elected will adopt that persona, and they will be interchangeable. So Trump doesn't make it through primary, and DeSantis gets
he's replaceable. He's replaceable.
Right, he's replaceable. There, but the figurehead, the leader of the party, will always adopt that strongman persona, and when their term is up, so long as they hang on to term limits, which I think they will, it's a distinctly American kind of, like, again, fascism takes on the contours of its culture. Then the next nominee of the party will take on that persona, but it will be minority rule. That party will not win the popular vote. They will win through electoral fraud, through gerrymandering, through voter suppression, and oftentimes through outright violence. So that's a characteristic of fascism we're going to be keeping an eye on.
So fascism emerges out of disillusionment.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has to establish legitimacy as a party. So we don't have a GOP anymore. We have a MAGA GOP.
It was very, yeah. It's very interesting to see the 2020 platform of the GOP convention just be a carbon copy of the 2016 platform. They didn't do any work. They didn't do any updating. They were just like, oh, actually, we are just really the party of Trump now.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to do any platform work. We're not going to change this. And I think that was a major shift even before January 6th, where we start to see this decline of conservatism and its replacement with this cult of personality and this creeping fascism. And as much as I disagree with a lot of conservative positions, I want conservatism to come back into that party, and I want fascism to go the fuck away.
Yeah, me too.
It's like we want that party to like restore its conservative values and roots, because at least then we're dealing with a party that believed in the republic, that believed in democratic elections, at least on the surface.
Yeah.
Right now we have a party that doesn't, that's outright rejecting the outcomes of elections and actively trying to interfere with free and fair elections by creating voter suppression laws and gerrymandering and basically dismantling the structures of our democracy.
So one of the ways that they gain power is that they develop these alliances with right-wing partnerships, which I think includes Christian nationalists and so forth, which is they've developed a certain cachet with that. And then a lot of these groups are actually emerging since the MAGA thing came about, Moms for Liberty and things like that. But then they use that power and association to dominate institutions like schools in particular, and which is pretty heartbreaking. And then they implement very radical reforms into these schools, which are completely anti-democratic. They're not for the good of all. They're not inclusive. They're very exclusive and demeaning, and as you well know. And I think that for us, one of the things that I think has made it so difficult is that we don't have any real media. In particular, we don't have any real media in Coos County, but even across the country, most of the mainstream media have adopted this fair and balanced thing where you show this side and you show that side and then you're done. But there's not like any real analysis done unless you start getting into more independent media organizations. And I think there's also this crossover between media and entertainment. And I think a lot of what Fox News just got punished for really was more like entertainment for their audience than it was for informing the public of how to make decent decisions. I would share that I just learned today that I think his name's Ken Paxton. He's being impeached. The Attorney General, he's being impeached in Texas. And I just heard, and I probably shouldn't even talk about it because I didn't do enough research ahead of time, but that he admitted in an interview that they did delay or interfere with the count of 2.5 million mail-in ballots and if they hadn't, the state would, believe it or not, Texas would have swung to Biden of all states. And it also had an impact on Beto O'Rourke in his gubernatorial race for the governor there. I think that's
I don't know what to say about that because I haven't looked into it, and it sounds sus, but it does fit with what we know about the rise of fascism. That it is definitely interested in suppressing the
vote.
If the society is a voting society, yes, suppressing the vote, suppressing the political power of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and we've seen the Texas legislature go very hard against the election systems in Harris County. Mm-hmm. Harris County being the county that the voters are starting to increase voting power that supports the Democratic Party. As frustrating as it is to imagine that the Democratic Party is the only option we have other than fascism, that's what we have right now with this two-party system, and they're going very hard after anyone who's voting Democrat, and suppressing votes and making it harder for anyone to make any change for the better in that state, because we know that state's been turning purple for a long time now, and it's I think it's going to stay red mainly because of voter suppression techniques and tactics. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to see, we are already starting to see the beginnings of minority party rule and the creation of one party rule structures in these states that are red states, or particularly red states that have been on the verge of purple. We saw this during the Jim Crow era. Yes. All the southern states were all Democrat, and they were like locked in, always Democrat. And because of that kind of social structure, it was a kind of a fascist style system. And we're starting to see it come back. We're starting to see some echoes of Jim Crow legislation alongside new forms of voter disenfranchisement and authoritarian state models. So, right. This time with the Republican Party.
So there is an argument that fascism doesn't really exist in force today. It certainly hasn't met it's not like the black shirts or the brown shirts, and that we've got that running around.
We do though.
But we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have these self-styled vigilante militias, and we have increased celebration of vigilantism among the leaders on the far right. Both Trump and DeSantis have celebrated the man who killed a homeless person on a subway recently. Both political leaders are celebrating vigilante killings while also promoting their positions as law and order kinds of people, which of course is a dog whistle. We can talk more about that another time. Yeah, we have these groups. We have the Proud Boys, we have the Oath Keepers, we have the Three Percenters, we have the Patriot Prayer. We have various different political gangs. That's because that's what they are, and they are their allegiance is to a party, despite the fact that there is no overt connection. This is the military wing of the Republican Party. That's not quite how it works, but their allegiance is to that party. Their leaders are on the stages with GOP leaders. They run for GOP office. Like Joey Gibson has run for office as a GOP candidate. There really is no difference between them in terms of their political allegiance, their partisan allegiance.
I
and
agree
so,
with you.
yeah, we absolutely have these kinds of groups running around. And back during the debates and the Trump versus Biden debates, we remember when Trump was given the opportunity to disavow the Proud Boys as a violent organization. And he said, Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. And not just a few months later, they were part of the organized effort to overturn the election and install Trump as leader.
Through the roof, and their membership went through the roof.
So we know that we have these brown shirts, black shirts types of folks running around in our society now, and they're engaged in street battles just like they were back in the 1930s, late 1920s, early 1930s Germany and Italy. Their behavior and their tactics are exactly the same. Their targets are different most of the time. Their targets are, they do have similar targets in terms of they're going after LGBTQ folks, just like they did in 1930s Germany, just like the KKK did in the 1960s and 70s. And but they're not going after, as overtly at least, they're not going after synagogues. They're not going after the Jewish community as hard. Anti-Semitism is rampant within their ranks, but that isn't where their directed energy is, because anti-Semitism isn't a popular American value.
At this moment
again,
in
fascism takes on the contours of the cultures that fostered it. So they keep their anti-Semitism as low-key, and it leaks out once in a while with people like Nick Fuentes and Kanye West and some of the other folks that are out there. But for the most part, they're keeping that under wraps, and they're leaning hard into this anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, because that's where they can create this alliance between the fascists, the secular fascists, and the Christian nationalists.
Right. So I think, in terms of what's happening here in Coos County, we have a variety of little things. For example, the county commission is a nonpartisan position, but there's actually 3 Republicans on the board right now. 2 of them, Bob Main and Rod Taylor, are pretty extreme. And Rod Taylor attended the January 6th insurrection. There's pictures of him in the east side entrance. He's carrying a sign that says "Fight like Flynn," referring to Michael Flynn, which, I mean, talk about a traitor. But now they're using their platform to, at the end of commission meetings, and there was a great letter to the editor written by Doug Jones, a local guy, and he pointed that out. He said, we're paying your salary and you're spending your comments dissing liberals, people who don't agree with you, and why are you turning this into a partisan event? And you're not paid for that. They're even calling for people to contact your Republican representative and tell him what a great job he's doing by walking out. So to me, it's gotten pretty severe. They're now considering, they've gotten a couple of right-wingers as on the North Bend School Board. Wingers isn't even the right term. Pro-fascist.
It is the right term. It is right wing. That's what it is.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem to. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it really identifies just their extreme beliefs. But
you can call them extremists. Then you can call them reactionaries. You can call them fascists.
Yeah.
They're in that cloud.
They're in that cloud. And they're now evaluating or going to help pick who becomes the next superintendent of schools. And one of the front runners, God forbid, is Mark Thielman, who's right in that ballpark. And just to think that man is going to be making policy decisions or that affect children, and seems to believe, I don't know whether he believes, but he has the support of people who think that there's furries running around in the schools and they're using litter boxes and it's and the latest is that being a furry is a precursor to sexual deviancy, and that somehow our schools are becoming indoctrination playgrounds. So to me, that gets back to this taking over institutions, and to me, it's really scary. I just feel like we have just gone backwards 50 years, and I'm fearful for the kids that are there. Even straight kids, I'm fearful for them.
Yeah. You named it right off the bat. We have nonpartisan positions being turned into partisan positions, covertly or overtly, and that's again a signifier of the rise of fascism. That's been one of the things that is a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, indicator. It's part of a political ideological takeover, and that's what we're observing. That we're watching people with extreme political views trying to take every possible position they can with any kind of power, and then to leverage that power towards a political aim rather than towards the function that that position is supposed to serve. And yeah, we're seeing it on school boards, we're seeing it in the county commission, and we're seeing it across fire departments, and we're seeing it everywhere. And what it does is it gives two things. It gives a level of legitimacy to an extremely illegitimate movement, in terms of we're a constitutional republic. We have a constitution that governs our system. That constitution, including our state constitution, determines what positions are partisan and which are not, and what those positions are for. And when you start operating in the way that these are operating, you're operating against the intentions or design of the Constitution. So you're operating against the interests of the republic. You're operating against the interests of the democracy. But we're also seeing then that they can leverage these positions to claim some degree of credibility. So even though their claims are extremely bizarre and non-factual and non-evidenced, they can still make these far-fetched claims, and that because they're in a position of authority that they've achieved, not because of their merits, but because of their political power, they get credibility for that. So they can make these claims about kids using litter boxes in schools. It's a hoax. It was a hoax when it was invented, and it hasn't
Right.
changed. It's part of this tactic that fascism uses to create threats, to invent threats, and then to direct public fear, anxiety, and outrage against those invented threats, and to gain support and power, because they are the people who are naming the threat that everyone else is denying exists, and they are the people that are capable of stopping the threat.
And they're the only ones who can fix it.
Yeah,
Right.
and so you see this here locally with this bizarre hoax that people like Diane Rich are propagating, and you see it elsewhere. You see it in Florida with DeSantis's campaign against wokeness, and you see it across the board with this false slanderous claim that trans people are groomers, that drag queens are groomers, that queer people in general, LGBTQI people in general, are sexualizing kids or after your kids, when we're, as a community, one of the safest places for families and kids, because we know, and the left has been the champion of modern rules around consent, around increasing the age of consent, around making sure that kids are safe, never less than two adults in the room. Those have been causes that we have championed, that our community honors and upholds, and they've been opposed almost all the time by conservatives. The age of consent thing is one of the things that conservatives have been opposing. We've tried to ban child marriage in multiple states where child marriage is illegal, and it's conservatives that are actually opposing those bans and keeping those bans from passing oftentimes. So we know that we are not the threat to children that the fascists are claiming we are, but they're inventing the threat to create an enemy, to scapegoat an enemy, and to turn public opinion against it, and to gain power that way. And so we know that's what this litter box thing is, and then that claim that leads to sexual deviance. It's part of the same scare tactic, the same conspiracy theory, and it's appealing to the QAnon people, because the QAnon conspiracy theory is right up that same language about threats to children. It's appealing to the Christian nationalists because it's bigoted against gay people and trans people, and it's appealing, of course, to the fascists because it's an opportunity to gain control over a nonpartisan institution like public schools, and to leverage those institutions to create a basis for spreading their own ideological perspective and preventing other ideological challenges to it. So it's basically taking control of education.
One of the things that I learned recently is that Commissioner Rod Taylor, insurrectionist, traitor, co-founder of Citizens Restoring Liberty, actually wants to appoint Diane Rich to some sort of county, I don't know whether he wants to put her on the planning commission or some position with the county. And I think it would be a volunteer position, but she's gotten herself onto something called the ONRI, which is a replacement for something called the Timber Unity. And so she now fancies herself a resource management expert.
That's a concern, and that's one of the concerns. What we've observed with fascist systems in the past, and what we're going to observe with this one is this problem of its capacity to function as a government system. There's this myth that the Nazis made the trains run on time, and it's a myth. Fascists are about ideological purity and loyalty. That is their number one concern, which means they're going to appoint and install people who are loyal, not people who are competent, because competence is not the concern. And so what you'll see is a breakdown in services. You're going to see a breakdown in the capacity for the government to function the way it should and to serve the needs and interests of the people, including the business classes that oftentimes support these fascists. So you're going to see incompetent people put in these positions that they're grossly underqualified for, and they're going to fail. They're going to fail, and the system itself will be unstable. And the way that they'll try to protect themselves is they'll ramp up the scapegoating, because they don't have any way of acknowledging their own failures or their own incapacity to actually be competent, nonpartisan leaders for a full society. They're still going to be just strict party loyalists, and that's all they're going to allow to take power. And so we're going to see that increase.
We certainly saw that with Donald Trump.
Yeah, we definitely did. We had so many people serving in as acting members of committees and agencies
who had no clue what they were doing,
because competence wasn't the issue. He wasn't interested in competence. He was interested in loyalty, and he got rid of competent people so that he could replace them with loyal people. And we saw a collapse in the functionality of government and its capacity. Like the census was terrible. It was still, we're still trying to like sort out what they did with the freaking census. Stuff that ordinary stuff suddenly becomes impossible to do,
or
because government doesn't work.
His handling of COVID.
Exactly. Not to say that Biden's has been much better. It's been pretty shite.
Yeah. I know, but I'm just saying that there was so many people put in positions, like Steve Bannon, for Christ's sake. Jared Kushner, who was in charge of everything, as far as I can tell.
This is just a natural problem with putting ideological purity and loyalty ahead of competence and functionality. And when you start turning nonpartisan positions into partisan positions, that's the result. And that's what we're going to see with people like Diane Rich getting appointed positions, is we're going to see a decline in competence and functionality of government.
I think it's interesting because Trump actually appointed Christopher Wray to head the FBI. I think it's the FBI, and he's a Trump appointee. He's a Republican, and now people are actually calling him a Democrat, and he's not even a rhino. He's a Democrat, and he's a never Trumper.
And you see
because exactly he's trying to do his job.
When someone does their job competently and doesn't lean instead on loyalty, but instead on the duties and responsibilities of the job, suddenly they're an enemy. Suddenly they're an enemy, and they're no longer qualified for that position, even though they're like, it's just one of the frustrating things about this kind of ideological extremism that we're seeing from the right. And we certainly don't want to see anything like that from the left either. But we're not seeing it from the left, because the left doesn't actually have any political power in this country. And what we're seeing instead is a slow fascist creep in our institutions, and we're seeing incompetence across the board. What was I going to say about that? Go ahead.
What I was going to say was that's part of what's motivated this effort, this little podcast that we do, and the radio station is a way to provide accurate information. And we were talking earlier before the show that I certainly have a bias I'm definitely left leaning. I, but I don't. I see that honestly. I see that more as it's just based on facts that what we've been doing has led to this huge inequity, wealth disparity, and and we're not really competitive with the rest of the world in basic things like healthcare even. And our educational system is lacking. And and I see that personally, I think the two-party system is lacking. And while I totally understand that you've got this party, Democrats, let's say, and they've got all this machinery in place. They've got all this stuff where they can mobilize, supposedly, and make things happen. They can send out all these emails and they can send out all these donation requests and they can do all these things. But they still aren't like they're going to run Joe Biden again. And they aren't able to like muster, I don't know, somebody younger. Age is not an issue necessarily, but you know, they're not actually running a, I don't know, even though I'm not 100% a Beto O'Rourke fan, at least he's not afraid to call somebody a motherfucker in a public meeting. So,
I think like when you first started, you were talking about like the reality that when we approach these topics, like the topics we've covered in the last few weeks, including this one, we do have a subjective perspective. We are not
right.
objective, and no one is. Everyone's got their own subjective viewpoint that they're applying to a situation or a condition. And we came out right off the bat saying that we're a pro-democracy podcast. We're going to have a pro-democracy show here. That indicates our bias, our values. And that means we're going to come to this conversation with an understanding that we are going to be favorable towards ideas and policies and personalities who are interested in serving the broad interests of the public, interested in creating social equality, interested in dismantling social inequality. And that's going to be our bias. That doesn't mean we're going to ignore facts, ignore science. In fact, facts and science are going to be like really important in guiding our understanding of the issues. But when it comes to the value judgments we make, we're going to be favorable towards pro-democracy. And that makes us pretty left-wing. And we get you getting called a commie Nazi. And
Yeah.
it's a complete misunderstanding of the political spectrum and a complete misunderstanding of how different ideological positions are organized on the classic left-right political spectrum, which itself is somewhat flawed. It's not exhaustive, but we should be clear about why fascism falls on the right of the political spectrum and why communism falls on the far left of the political spectrum. It's because they have very different interests. And the spectrum itself goes all the way back to an actual physical location, right and left, in the National Assembly in France in 1789. So about the same time the United States is ratifying our Constitution, the French had themselves a revolution, an anti-monarchical revolution, just like ours was. And they had a National Assembly, and in that assembly, there were delegates sat in the assembly who were pro-monarchy, and they were in favor of the king. And then you had delegates who were anti-monarchy, and they were in favor of the revolution. And the pro-monarchy people sat on the right side of the assembly, and the pro-revolution people sat on the left. And that's where the right wing and left wing perspective came in. the right wing has consistently been identified with ideologies that believe in social hierarchies, social inequalities, and
right,
argue that those social hierarchies and social inequalities are either natural or they're good and or they're necessary, and or that they don't exist. Sometimes these movements will pretend that those social hierarchies don't exist so that they can perpetuate the inequalities that those social hierarchies preserve. For example, the modern day claim on the right that racism is over is one of those ways in which they deny that there is still a social hierarchy or social inequality so that they can perpetuate that the continued existence. Basically the old adage that the biggest lie the devil ever told is that the devil doesn't exist.
right,
But so right-wing political ideologies are going to be favorable towards social inequality, social hierarchies. Left-wing ideologies are about creating social equality across the board. So left-wing politics are interested in achieving social equality, egalitarianism, and right wings are interested in preserving social hierarchies and inequalities. That's it. That's the left political spectrum. That's what it means to be on the spectrum, is how far down you go in terms of trying to promote social equality and egalitarianism, to where you get sometimes to these really far left positions, anarchism and communism, or to the far you get various far right positions, including fascism and monarchialism or
right,
monarchism or whatever we call it. So that's it. Fascism is on the far right. Communism is on the far left. They're diametrically opposed. You can't be a commie Nazi. Can you have policy similarities between them? Yeah, you can. If you're trying to impose state control, a state-controlled system, or control over the economy or control over, yeah, you can have policy similarities. For example, the state can control the media in a fascist system. The state can control the media in a communist system. State-controlled media isn't necessarily going to fall specifically on the spectrum. It's going to be, what is
yeah,
the message that that media is trying to promote? What is the intention or purpose of that state control? And if that purpose is creating and articulating the justification for a social hierarchy, then it's going to be a far right state controlled media. If it's interested in promoting the narrative of class, the abolition of class, and complete equality, dictatorship of the labor classes, that is going to be a far left position of state controlled media. So that's how the political spectrum works. It's whether a policy is fascist, far right, or whether it's far left, or whether it's centrist, is going to depend on what stance it takes on social equality or social inequality. That's going to be it.
okay.
Now,
So,
go ahead. Sorry, I talked enough.
what I was going to say though is one of the things that's happening around here is that there is a lot of misinformation that is spread around. The commissioners, in addition to bashing the left, are referring to climate change as hooey. They brought up that only people who talk about racism are racists, and I can't remember everything else that they said. And I got this from somebody else, but and then there's a couple of outlets locally, including Diane Rich's Coos News, which it's just embarrassing to see that somebody would actually put that out.
Anti-intellectualism is one of the tactics of fascism. So if you're going
There
to be,
you go.
you're going to see the promotion of materials that are really not bright out there.
Not right. Right.
Propaganda, conspiracy theory thinking, that kind of stuff is just par for the course for that side of the political spectrum, because it's got to be able to create, especially in a society like ours that has some degree of democratic structure, you have to be able to accumulate the support of a critical mass of people to support an agenda that is actually not in their own interests. And in order to
Yes.
convince a number of people to join your cause, which is actually about consolidating power for a minority of people that really doesn't include them, you have to lie to them. You have to
Yeah.
pretend you're on their side, and you have to
Yeah.
give them a false reality so that they don't know who their real enemies are, and that redirect their animosity towards the threats to fascism, which are democratic institutions, the Constitution, and the people that are going to actually protect and defend those.
Mm-hmm.
And look at even ideologies of social equality as a threat. So the support of full inclusion and rights for LGBTQ people, ending mass incarceration, these kinds of things become the enemy, and the gullible people become the unwitting allies of a movement that's actually not to their advantage. And I think people like Rich and Taylor, and I generally think it's weird to call it giving them the benefit of the doubt, but I give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't really understand and they don't really comprehend, and they get led around by illusions and lies and propaganda
Yeah.
that don't have any factual basis. We saw this with QAnon. We see this with the election fraud lies, and we see this with the bad faith perspectives on gender in society, where they claim to have a scientific point of view when they don't understand science. They literally do not understand the science. So the fascists are going to capitalize on that. They're going to keep capitalizing on that, and their broad base of support are going to live in this kind of illusory reality, this non-reality, where they think they know what's up and what's down, and they really don't. They're lost. And
Yeah.
it's really hard. It's really hard to pull them out of that. It's like being in a cult. And we saw this with the mega crowd. It's the same people. They are very indoctrinated in this system. And the groundwork for that indoctrination has been laid for decades. It's been laid in the fundamentalist Christian churches, in this anti-intellectualism, anti-science perspectives, where they absolutely reject biology and evolution, theory of evolution, which is fact, which is supported by a preponderance of evidence and by the vast majority of biologists, like overwhelmingly, to the point to deny that evolution is fact. They've also had to have a piggyback of this idea that all of these scientists are conspiring. They're lying.
Yeah.
And so that distrust of academia, of intellectualism, of education, that kind of distrust has created a whole class of people in our society that are ready to believe conspiracy theories, to believe that there is these illusory threats out there.
So I have a mixed feeling about. I agree with everything that you said, but I feel when you have a platform like a radio program,
Mhm.
or you're an elected official, that you have a responsibility to
Oh,
to tell the truth. And so when people like Taylor just throw garbage out there about critical race theory, and even stuff that's been completely debunked thanks to lawsuits, many of which were filed by their hero, Donald Trump himself. I think it's, I think it, I think it's not just irresponsible, but I think it's almost. I'm not willing to say that they really believe that. I just feel like they're.
right. I think that's fair. I think when I said I give the benefit of the doubt, I don't intend
Yeah.
the absolution of responsibility. When I indicated or named Taylor, I was talking about Rod, who I don't think is a malicious person. I do tend to think that Rob is a malicious person. I think he's demonstrated the fruits of malice. And so I think that there's a recognition that I think a lot of these people, even if they aren't being served by the interest of the fascist movement, like it's not in their best interest, it does pull in people who find an opportunity to be, it's an opportunity or an outlet for a part of themselves that doesn't get free reign. And it gives them opportunity for that. So we do see the bullies come out. We do see a kind of a level of nastiness and meanness and cruelty that just wasn't a normal part of our culture and society even 2 decades ago. And it's not getting better because of these kinds of vitriolic voices and this kind of hateful rhetoric and stuff like that. And I do think that we can combat it by being civil and by giving one another benefit of the doubt and doing our best to try to bring education and knowledge and everything like that, like being compassionate. I think all of those are really important. We have to recognize that a great deal of these people who are involved in the movement are not themselves, if they were to look at the characteristics of fascism, they would say, oh, wait, I don't want to be this. I think giving them that opportunity to learn and maybe escape from that movement and actually oppose it. I've known conservatives to do that. Close friends that I've sat down and played video games with have become vocal opponents of this trend within on the far right in this takeover of the Republican Party. So I'm hopeful that that we can reach people by starting with that sense of give them the benefit of the doubt that they probably aren't themselves deliberately interested in consolidating power for a minority rule of fascist leaders. But they need to know what fascism is.
What is that beeping noise?
Oh, that's the security camera, the motion detector letting me know on the security cameras that there's some movement out there. It's a windy day, so it just keeps beeping the entire time I've been here. I'm not going nuts, but give me a few more days. I think we're getting a little over an hour. I do want to give people a reference to look at since we didn't touch on all of the points. Get your Google out. Look up Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco's 14 Points of Fascism is a very early analysis of initially Italian fascism, which Eco survived. And he has been influential on research into fascism since. You can also look at Lawrence W. Britt, 14 Characteristics of Fascism. Britt is looking at American facets of fascism. So remember, fascism takes on the contours of the culture in which which produces it. Right. So Lawrence Britt's 14 Characteristics are looking at American fascism. And then if you're really interested in taking a dive in, look up Jason Stanley, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. It's a book on fascism. And Jason Stanley wrote this book. It outlines the 10 tactics of fascism. It's a book worth reading. It's really relevant for our time. Unfortunately, really relevant for our time. So those are 3 things I would recommend Googling to learn more about fascism and what it is and whether or not you might inadvertently be participating in it. Right. Hi, Bailey. Feel free to do some research on the backgrounds of the left and right politics, the histories of right-wing politics. It's gone through several phases since the days of the revolt against monarchy. And oftentimes the figures that were allies in the revolt against monarchy have now become adversaries in the movement towards social equality. So those are things worth studying and looking into.
Yeah. It is interesting how they come full circle over time. And
no licks, only kisses, no licks.
think
So
he's trying to get in on the act too. So maybe we should put them in our place. So
we get way more viewers if these folks were the front and
that's
center,
true.
wouldn't we?
That's true. That's true. Okay, I want to thank my co-host Israel again for a very informative and well-researched contribution to the program, and I hope you'll join us again next week.
Yeah.
We'll figure out what we're going to talk about next.
Thank you too. I'm really glad that you have your fingers on the pulse of local media outlets and personalities in what's going on here, because I don't necessarily pay that close of attention to what's happening in terms of local. I try to, but I don't have the time to give them have time to listen to their crap.
Right.
So, I really appreciate that you do, and you have other people who are connected to you that share what's going on there, because then I learn what's going on too. So it's important from my perspective, especially in terms of finding out what's happening locally.
Yeah.
So thanks so much.
There's a lot happening locally. All right, thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.